Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are sitting today. Trying to get time zones on virtual meetings on Zoom is a bit more of a challenge. I'd like to thank you all. We have a great panel today, led by, as moderator, by an old friend and colleague, David Rundell, and almost everybody else on the panel is an old friend and colleague. Just to briefly set the stage, the Gulf has been hit by not a black swan event, but by a whole flock of black swans. Prices are down, driven both by a combination of a pandemic and by the fact that the United States has now become a major producer. The relationship between the United States and the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia in particular, has become much more interesting, for want of a better term, in that we seem to be picking a fight with the Iranians while telling the Saudis and the others that we're not there to protect them anymore. So this is a great team to put together to discuss the future, the economic future of the most important Arab state in the region right now. Thank you, David. Take it from there.
Well, good morning. I think everyone who's on this call this morning knows that Saudi Arabia is going through rather profound political, economic, and social changes. Today, we're going to talk about some of those economic changes and challenges, and we have a very distinguished group of three professional economists to help us unravel some of the issues that are facing the Saudi economy today. The first is Dr. Hani Findakly. He is the vice chairman of the Clinton Group. He has a distinguished career on Wall Street, where he worked for firms like Drexel Burnham and Payne Weber. He worked with the World Bank, and he was on the faculty of his own alma mater, MIT. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a receiver, or winner, I should say, of the Ellis Island Congressional Medal of Honor. He's going to speak today about the future of the Saudi economy. What are the most pressing problems facing the Saudi economy, and how can the government deal with those with the diminished resources that it now has? Does Saudi Arabia have an economic plan? Was it a good plan in 2015? Is it still a good plan in 2020? And what's the likelihood of it helping them to reach the goals that they've set for themselves in Vision 2030? Then we have Dr. Ghiyath Nakshbendi. He's a professor of finance at his alma mater, American University in Washington, D.C. He was a Fulbright scholar. He taught at the King Saud University in Riyadh. He has lived for many years in Kuwait, and he was one of the pioneers in introducing Islamic finance into the United States by creating one of the first graduate level certificates in that important subject. He's going to speak to us today about fiscal problems and fiscal policy in Saudi Arabia. Specifically, how can the Saudi government deal with its current budget deficit? And what does that mean for its international borrowing, its asset sales, the dollar peg? And what role will the PIF, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, play in all of this? And finally, we have Dr. Bessma Momani, the only one who I was reasonably confident that I would pronounce her name correctly. And she is the Vice President for International Relations and a full professor of political science at Waterloo University. She was also a Fulbright scholar. She's been a visiting scholar at Georgetown, a visiting fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute and at Brookings and at the Stimson Center here in Washington. She's also been a senior advisor to the IMF and the Canadian government. And she will discuss the options that the Saudi government today faces in stimulating their economy, particularly as relates to the private sector. So with that, I will turn the conversation over to Dr. Findakly.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Thank you for Gulf International Forum for inviting me to this. And I hope everybody online is safe and well at home. Those are unusual circumstances we all face. And as the moderator suggested, the Saudi challenges are quite unique and probably come at the wrong time in economic cycle. My focus is going to be on the economic issues, and I will probably follow three short lines. One is how we got here, what brought us to this point. The second line follows from that is where do we stand currently and what challenges do we face? And finally, I would try to take a look ahead as to what the future holds and what are the impediments and resources that are available for the government to deal with the current crisis. So the first line basically is how we got here. It is no mystery. It's basically oil revenues that funded the government. The government then spent that money into the economy. It went into a variety of areas, into infrastructure, into social services, into military spending. And most importantly, it went into job creations. About 2/3 of the entire labor force of Saudi Arabia, the citizens of Saudi Arabia, work for a government entity in one form or another. So since most of the economic activities in the economy were driven by government spending, which was driven by oil, the dependence on oil continued to be self-perpetuating, and it continued to limit the ability of the economy to create a multiplier effect, what economists call the multiplier effect, that would have spun off new businesses and new activities that would have led into the diversification of the economy. So the government has long, I have been going to Saudi Arabia for the last 45 years or so, and I have in just about every visit listened to governments talking about the need to diversify the economy and about the risk of dependence strictly on oil as the major driver of economic activities and government revenues. But change has been difficult to do, and I have been wondering about that, and I kept thinking that despite the good intentions, in good times there's no incentive to change, and in bad times the pain is too hard to inflict, so governments tend to balk away from making any change. The last attempt, of course, was the Vision 2030 that our moderator had spoke about. And it was a very serious attempt and detailed and highly publicized attempt to create the conditions for diversifying the economy. I have been supportive of the overall goals of the plan, but for those who have followed the work I do, know that I have been very skeptical about the success and the potential for success of that plan. My reason for skepticism from the very beginning, 2015, I've written on that extensively, was twofold. One is the plan itself did not address the fundamental economic structure that would have changed the economic model of Saudi Arabia that has obviously gone past its usefulness. And the second, it was completely driven by transactional type activities that embodied some spending commitments that far exceeded the ability of the economy to generate any kind of revenues, or even a fraction of that. So it was even under very optimistic scenarios. So it was bound to stall, I guess, is the right way. and maybe be ripe for another review at this point. So this is where we are. We have basically a welfare state that is now over, and a new economy that is likely to replace it. Where it's headed, it's anybody's guess. We have, and it's important to look at numbers that basically tell us where the path is going to be. Government spending has continued unabated despite the fact that revenues and economic growth over the last 5 years has basically stagnated and been pretty much negative. The cumulative budget deficits that the government has incurred over the last 5 years through 2019 was about 350 billion US dollars. It's likely to rise by another, by my estimate, 120 to 140 billion this year in 2020. Quite a bit of it is going to depend on the cost of the prices of oil between now and year end. But we can count on about $120 billion or so in deficit compared to about 40 billion estimate, 50 billion estimate in the budget that was announced in December. The fact that oil revenues have declined only tells part of the story. The government suffered other declines in revenues, including, for example, because of the COVID-19, including, for example, the Hajj and Umrah, which generates another $15 billion or so, in my estimates, for the economy. The VAT tax, the 5% tax that was enacted a few years ago on businesses and activities, will probably generate only about a third of what was estimated by the government at the time. And the government has financed a $350 billion deficit, a cumulative deficit over the last 5 years by basically a combination of borrowing both domestically and internationally, and by drawing down the foreign exchange reserves, which the circular from the forum has mentioned is down to about 450 billion US dollars from about 750 billion in 2015. Now, these figures are important because they probably tell us where government focus is going to be over the next several years. So at current oil prices, I estimate that Saudi oil revenues for 2020 will be about $110 billion. Saudi Arabia has a major issue, and that is that it consumes about a third of all the oil it produces, and therefore the revenues from production is not all denominated in dollars. Only about 2/3 of it is denominated in dollars. So net-net, the government is going to have a foreign exchange drawdown, including import bill, which runs about $130 billion a year, workers' remittances and others. It will have probably a reduction in its foreign exchange reserves of about $150 billion to $160 billion. That will bring the net foreign exchange reserves to about $300 billion, which is adequate for the government to run itself for the next couple of years. But it's low enough that any further decline from that, a serious further decline from that, will result in probably a reassessment by the rating agencies of the credit standing of the government, and therefore its ability to tap into the international markets. So where do we go from here? I have argued that every crisis exposes a country and a government to weaknesses and fault lines, some of which it knew, some of which it discovered through the crisis. In the case of Saudi Arabia, some of these fault lines were known, and that is the ability or the dependence on oil to sustain the economy, a very weak private sector, and obviously a poor social infrastructure of healthcare a social safety net that is, robust enough to cushion the shock to the system, which currently does not exist. There's a larger issue, and that's an issue I have been arguing for over 10 years, and that is the inability of the government to stimulate the economy at times of a crisis. This key issue will continue to hound the economy and limit its ability to grow in the foreseeable future. It arises mainly from the link of the Saudi riyal to the US dollar. Because the link is there, the ability of the government to print money, in effect, is not there. So when the US government or US Congress authorized $6 trillion in additional spending to help cushion the economic shock, the EU, Japan, China, other Asian countries have done the same. Saudi Arabia were unable to do that. In effect, they did the exact opposite. Instead of doing what economic orthodoxy suggests, which is that when the economy is down, you try to stimulate it by increasing spending and by a combination of monetary and fiscal policy. Monetary policy is limited by the link to the dollar, and fiscal policy is limited to the link to the dollar. So instead of stimulating the economy, the Saudi government moved to actually dampen an already weak economic growth and working in what economists called pro-cyclical policy. I've long held the view, for those who have followed my work, is that this crisis in Saudi Arabia and in the neighboring GCC countries was bound to happen. It was coming. I called in 2017 that the region faces what I call a Minsky moment, which is an economic argument in which it's an economic inflection point in which asset prices and market prices completely freeze and the economy works into a tailspin. COVID-19 only accelerated that point, and instead of bringing it in 2 or 3 years from now, it happened today. I hope that becomes a major incentive for the government of Saudi Arabia and for neighboring countries to go through a complete strategy, which is what I call a creative destruction. Change the economic model that Vision 2030 should have focused on from the very beginning. So let me close on a hopeful note. I don't see the economic crisis that the Saudi face today as an existential one. It's a very serious one, but it is not existential. They still have time to work and move on the economic fronts. It should compel the policymakers to basically break up the old economic model, as I call it, to devolve the economic decision-making and power to the private sector by basically channeling and allocating resources, capital, to more productive value-added activities instead of big white elephant projects that the government has so far focused on. Finally, there was a mention at the introduction on the issue of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I believe that the Sovereign Wealth Fund is a savings account for the country. It's not a speculative ATM machine for the government to use, and therefore I believe that its highest priority is to direct its investments and resources to unlock the energies of the private sector and the people, and to help probably focus on small and medium-sized enterprises. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. I think we now have time for, we'll take questions when this is all over, when the speakers have all had their chance to present their case. or answer the questions we outlined at the beginning. So now we'll turn to our second speaker.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the good introduction of Mr. Rundell and for the Gulf International Forum for the invitation. To start with, I was asked to comment on very simple, small topics to discuss in 8 minutes. And so I'm going to do my best. First of all, I'm not an economist. I am a person who has been in finance for about 30 years. I came back to teaching only recently in the last 10 years. I am very well familiar with but in the meantime, I am very thankful for my colleague, Dr. Findakly, who basically covered most of the issues that I was going to speak about. And for that, thank you so much. Basically, what I'm trying to address here, talking about the issues connected with the fiscal situation for Saudi Arabia, and then I'm going to talk about my area of expertise, sovereign wealth fund. I worked for this fund back in the 80s, and so I know a little bit about sovereign wealth funds. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of borrowing. And then I'm going to talk about something which is very close to my heart, dealing with entrepreneurship and SMEs. But really and truly, over the last, I would say about 3 months, I have been listening, I have been participating in discussions. I think what is important here to recognize and keep in mind that what we are witnessing, it is not new, but we are witnessing a very special situation that we never encountered. Therefore, when people ask about what XYZ country should do and so on and so forth, I always maintain the position. Number one, it is a very extraordinary situation globally. Number two, all these issues in terms of suggesting remedies and so on and so forth is connected with finding a final resolution to the COVID-19. So let's accept that as given. That's number one. Number two, when we talk about the Saudi government fiscal policies and so on, I think they are doing their best, and they do what every government will do when they are faced with unprecedented situation. And unfortunately, it happened after the decline in oil prices and after the issue of Saudi Arabia with Russia in terms of limiting the output, oil output and so on. But in the meantime, they took in my book, they took a very quick action by, let's say, suspending the cost of living allowances, which is going to start, actually it started June 2020. And as my colleague mentioned, in terms of the value-added taxes, it was tripled. Now it is 15% starting in July. So this is one course of action that will help to alleviate some of the issues connected with lack of revenue, number one. Number two, to reduce the expenses. All the estimates so far in terms of how much the economy is going to be contracted, we are talking about probably between 2.5% to 3% contracting in the Saudi economy, which is globally, it was expected to be about 3%. So the situation in Saudi is not an exception. Again, when we talk about Saudi Arabia, we have to appreciate one fact, which is unfortunately sometimes it is overlooked. But at the end of the day, the wealth of Saudi Arabia is in the ground, in the oil, the largest producing country of oil in the world. So they have the reserve. Again, when we talk about some of the economic indicators, I mean, sometimes we overlook the fact, for example, that when we talk about Saudi, their external debt as a percentage of GDP is very reasonable, It's about 20, 28, 29%. The reserve, as my colleague mentioned, it is good, but in the meantime, we have to appreciate the fact that planning is great, and I always wonder when they envision Saudi 2030. I was wondering if there was a scenario B and scenario C, but definitely in my book, I don't think the planners of the vision to face what we have been facing in the last 6 months or so. Now let me move to the question of sovereign wealth fund. The fact of it is that unfortunately this particular topic is not well understood by so many people, and there are very few people who appreciate the function, the management, and what have you. As my colleague mentioned, when we talk about sovereign wealth fund, really we are talking about long-term investor. Long-term investor, that's number one. Number two, when you talk about the management of the sovereign wealth fund, we have to appreciate that it is designed to either provide good living for the citizens of that particular country, or to face some unprecedented situation. And as you know, Kuwait was the pioneer, actually. The first sovereign wealth fund in the world was established by Kuwait back in 1953. And again, we all know that when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq, the sovereign wealth fund of Kuwait managed to sustain the good living conditions for Kuwaitis all over the world, number one. And then it helped in terms of liberating it from the invasion. So when we look at the Saudi sovereign wealth fund, it has a good number of investment, about $375 billion. Definitely, as you know, and I think recently, the Saudi Arabian the central bank, Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, transferred about $40 billion to the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia, which is called Public Investment Fund, PIF, in order to augment, or in order to accelerate some of their investment activities. But what is interesting is that recently, one of the issues that the PIF is considering is selling their ownership of SABIC, which is Saudi Arabian Basic Industrial Corporation, to Aramco for about approximately $69 billion. And again, there's a question here about Aramco and what is the position of Aramco now in terms of their share. As you recall, they started by proposing to sell 5%, and then they went back to sell 1.5%. The issue with Aramco sale was that the majority of those who contributed to purchase the shares were locals in Saudi. But one of the interesting activities of the PIF is that they spent good amount of money recently, actually, in buying shares of Facebook, Walt Disney, and so on and so forth, which is good because as I mentioned earlier, when you talk about sovereign wealth fund, you are talking about long-term investor, and definitely you don't react and you don't change your investment policies and planning because of certain unprecedented situation like what we are having here. So my point here is very simple, that I think, and I feel that PIF is following a very good traditional policies in order to cater for what they have and to manage their investment portfolio. Again, we have ups and downs in terms of prices of stock and what have you. But again, we always connect all these with the issue of two things. Number one, the price of oil, and number two is the policies that the Vision 2030 is going to deal with. Now, my very big comment about what I call the entrepreneurship activities or the Saudi future in terms of creating employment opportunities, we have to appreciate one fact, that in the Saudi Arabian Vision of 2030, it is mentioned there, it was part of the deal, two things. Number one, that they want to increase the contributions of SMEs from 20% to 35%. And then the question about lowering the unemployment rate from 11 something to 7%. But we have to appreciate a couple of things about entrepreneurship in Saudi, and actually it is not in Saudi only, it is in the GCC and to a large degree in MENA region. One of the major issues that I found by interacting, number one, and seeing quite a number of Saudi students of mine at Kurgaz School of Business in the last couple of years, that they are motivated when they go back to work independently, to work in the private sector. It is culture, unfortunately, that we are risk averse, we have averse mentality, and that will documented by our inability to accept failure sometimes when we start a business. And again, I cannot elaborate much about it now because of the short period of time, but really this is one of the most important impediments of starting personal or private activities in the Gulf. Again, as I mentioned. So when you want to start a business on your own, you have to accept the question of risk. You have to have possibilities of making good profit. But one of the issues that I found in Saudi, for example, when you talk about incubators, these incubators are mostly connected with the government. And unfortunately, the private sector in Saudi does not, as far as I know, does not contribute to enhancing or financing incubators to expand the facilities that are open to the to Saudi young people, men and women as well. And unfortunately, again, the question of legislation, we have very limited legislation that would enhance and encourage entrepreneurship, and I hope that will change. So in conclusion, I think when it comes to Saudi, the way I see it from my vantage point as an observer of what's going on, I feel comfortable that these things are going to be overcome. But again, in the meantime, we have to have more open attitude towards encouraging young people to join the labor force independently, part of the SMEs, and discourage them from joining government because of so many reasons. So in conclusion, I think I am personally optimistic that things are going to work well. In the meantime, definitely, we have to appreciate the fact that we cannot judge what's going on in Saudi based on the COVID-19 and the changes in balance of doing business across the universe, actually, not in Saudi. It is, we are witnessing this in the United States, in the UAE, and in European Economic Union, Russia, China, and so on. Thank you for listening, and I will be more than happy to entertain questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now we'll have our last speaker to talk about what the Saudi government may be able to do to overcome this rather unprecedented circumstances that the whole world is facing. They have a unique economy. It's very different, as Dr. Findakly pointed out. Their ability to use fiscal policy, their ability to use monetary policy are both relatively limited compared to most economies. So just what can they do to stimulate their economy? So Dr. Momani, over to you.
Thanks, David, and thank you for Gulf International Forum for including me in this conversation. No, I really appreciate much of what's been said, and I think I'm going to pick up on that. And I'm a political economist, so I do have to point out that it's, to me, about seeing where there's room for governments to be able to intervene and to, sorry about that, hit my mute button by accident. So, I mean, I think as a political economist, I'm very much interested in sort of what are the policy proposals that could be done. And I also take a very international focus on understanding the global economy. And of course, we've been talking about some of the vulnerabilities and opportunities that the Saudi economy faces, but you can't ignore the reality that this is all about oil. At the end of the day, oil is, of course, the most important commodity that I think, in my humble opinion, really sort of cements the entire global economic system. But that's to a different point. When we look at the Saudi budget, when we look at its finances, you can't escape the reality that it's highly dependent on favorable oil prices. And the reality is, I don't think we're going to see the kinds of levels of oil prices that either the Saudi government or any oil producer wants. And it's just a reality of the entire global demand of oil, the decline in worldwide consumption because of this pandemic. And frankly, I don't think it's coming around or recovering anytime soon. Many people suggest that, you know, this is, and we've heard lots of theories about whether or not this recovery, potential recovery, is going to be a U shape, a V shape, or the Nike swoosh shape. It really points to the reality that there is a lot of uncertainty, but in my humble opinion, I think what we see is a very protracted recovery process. And I don't think we're going to see anything really pick up for at least a year, maybe longer. Some are even talking about whether or not, you know, a vaccine is even doable. Of course, that means that we're going to have to adjust to a new normal and the kinds of global economic recovery that we're expecting, maybe even, I think, further down the road. So on that, I think that the challenges are long-term. And so one of the things that we've seen coming out of the Saudi government is, I think, is a recognition that they need to sort of prepare for that rainy day. And some of the interesting stuff we've seen, for example, include you know, some allowances, public sector allowances that have been given, very generous ones since 2018 decreased. We saw the very unusual announcement of tripling the value-added taxes. I think for many who know the Gulf economies, this has been something that they've been kind of playing with recently. It went, in the case of Saudi Arabia, from 5% to 15%. That tripling is pretty unprecedented. And I think for those of you who have been following Saudi news, just introducing a 5% was seen as, you know, quite earth-shattering. And now we're talking about tripling that in very, very short order. I think it's a smart decision. I think what you need to, as for governments to do, is to think about what do they want to be as an economy in 2 to 3 years. And I think consumption taxes is where I think you take out a lot of that unnecessary, futile spending. It includes also, I think, an opportunity for reinvestment into more productive sectors, and having, you know, at the household level, people think about their consumption and how they appropriately spend their finances. So that's a good thing. Will we see more of that? Of course, that's going to be the big issue, because this is a country that's very generous in its welfare policies. It is, I think, for lack of a better term, a very generous welfare state. It has been subsidizing its people for a very long time. And I think anybody who's been following some of the reforms that we've seen from Saudi Arabia in the past at least 5 years, there's been an effort to try to move people away from that. And certainly, of course, those of us who are watching the actions of Mohammed bin Salman, its de facto leader, we can say that he's really been tightening the noose on its people, and even in its inner circle, to be less wasteful. So that I think is going to continue. We've also seen an increase in custom taxes just recently announced. So it went from, I believe, 2 to 15% on a whole host of different sectors. And this to me is very interesting because I think, and this is where I think there is some smart thinking about trying to talk about, national independence on certain sectors, thinking about how do we move away from this over-dependence on imported goods. I think like many of my colleagues, we've been watching the Gulf economies for years, and there's been lots of debates about, strategic independence on, trying to be more independent in food, for example, which is a huge issue. The entire Gulf, by virtue of its climate being very, very difficult to grow things, is quite dependent on food imports. But as you know, and I think as many of us who, both in the West and the East have seen, supply chains have been decimated by this crisis. And I think it's going to open a huge public debate and conversation out there about how do we nationalize certain industries, protect certain industries. My colleagues have talked about decoupling and the end of globalization. I think that that's maybe a bit exaggerated in terms of the public press talking about those big words like deglobalization, but there is going to be a reversion to localization. And some of that may be regionalization. So certainly Saudi Arabia has done historically investments in farms in Africa and other parts of the Middle East to try to create a more dependable national supply. I think there's going to be more of that. And we've seen some creative things that have been done to try and increase food supply. And that's a really interesting area that might be worthy of further exploration. Look, certainly Saudi Arabia is not going to be in the worst scenario compared to other emerging market economies or G20 countries, just by virtue of its reserves, its access to a host of both mostly capital debt, but certainly it's able to go to the markets, it's able to go to, if it wants to, I doubt this is going to happen, but organizations like the IMF and others to really get the finances it needs. So it's not going to be hurting nearly as much as I think some other countries. That said, I think it's mindful that it's going to be incurring a lot of debt, and that's everywhere. The world economy is such that, and I'm mindful of having, I wasn't a senior advisor, Daniel, I worked for the Independent Evaluation Office at the IMF, but one of the things that one of the things I'm mindful of is just the messaging that's coming out of the IMF. And this is really interesting times because we're not getting the usual, this is the time to promote fiscal consolidation, one needs to be careful about one's spending. Quite the contrary, we've seen the managing director issue, messages of spend, fiscal stimulus, which really is frankly not the IMF's usual messaging. So it says something about how many in the macroeconomic space are really concerned that this is not a time to be worried too much about debt because there's a bigger challenge before us with this pandemic and this lockdown and the entire collapse of all demand, consumption, and production. So I think we're going to see more of that. But interesting that the Saudi government hasn't done too much on the fiscal stimulus. There is some. We've seen, for example, some support to the private sector, which is fantastic. And of course, like all Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia has been trying to really beef up its private sector. It's been a challenge, certainly because of just how so many state-owned enterprises crowd out private businesses, but there are a whole host of other structural challenges that make it difficult for private sectors to compete. I think one thing we're going to see, and this is back to another issue that I'm quite concerned with, which is unemployment. And this is a global phenomenon. We're seeing the rise of numbers. I think last reported, Saudi Arabia had 12% unemployment. Youth unemployment is devastating, of course, throughout the region, but in many Gulf countries, it's even more so. And so, what is the response going to be of government? Well, Saudiization, this idea of the labor force mostly imposing on the private sector to take on more Saudi nationals and less foreign nationals, I think is going to be something we're going to see more of. I would recommend it. I think it's smart policy making. It certainly fits in, I think, a very sort of pro-youth mantra that this government is trying to espouse. And there's hunger for it. Now, the private sector hasn't historically liked that, and that goes to, I think, some of the previous commentators' comments about everything from, questionable work ethic, not necessarily always seeing the same kind of productivity one would get from foreign nationals than you would get from locals. But I think that's changing. And I think people who have this idea that, you know, the locals of today are far lazier than foreign nationals, that's changing. Attitudes are changing. I think many of us who have been watching Saudi Arabia see some interesting, you know, development of Saudis going and working in everything from your local McDonald's. I mean, that kind of service sector involvement of Saudi youth is quite new, and I think it's a refreshing attitude. It's important to bring that in because it, I think, changes the conversation or the social contract between the state and the people. It certainly, I think, takes people off the public welfare system, and increasingly, I think, the reality of just the finances of the average Saudi household is such that it needs to encourage all parts of its household, including women, to be active parts of the economy. We've seen lots of great strides in that, although lots of more work to be done, I think, in really getting full economic participation of women in the Saudi sector. So I think there's going to be more investment in strategic industries. I would suspect, you know, places to watch is more investment in food. I think this is not something we can ignore. There's been so much concern about supply chains in the global economy that I think every government must be internalizing at this moment as we, as I said, thinking about nationalization and localization of production. A big sort of question mark I have is about the mega projects, which, as we all know, Saudi Arabia has had plenty of and continues to talk about these great projects from NEOM to others, which really do pick up on a lot of tourism, you know, certainly entertainment, which again, I don't think is a bad thing in of itself, but I just don't see where tourism fits into the plans nowadays. I mean, we are just seeing the entire tourism and travel sector being decimated by this pandemic, and I don't think it's going to recover. So we're going to have to see where sort of the construction in all of these great tourism projects are going to go. I think it would be wise to put them kind of on hold at the moment. Of course, those are really flashy PR exercises that the current government wants to be able to say is ongoing and, you know, things are normal, but reality is things aren't normal. And we do need to, I think, be cautious of where public spending is going. So that's something to watch in terms of a big sector. Similarly, entertainment. I mean, I think the sad thing is there's probably a lot of money being poured into entertainment, obviously things like theaters and all the rest, but those are kind of the ripe conditions where you see this virus flourishing. And I think it's very difficult for any public health agency to see how you can tell concert goers and theater goers and the rest of it to come back out again. So it's going to be difficult. And that really just points to the reality that all of the sectors that Saudi Arabia was going to go into in terms of investment and public focus are really the ones that are, you know, most hit at the moment. So I'm interested to see what's coming out of the government. The indication of the VATs, again, the value-added taxes, to me, suggest that it's going to try to take this opportunity. Certainly, I think we've seen in terms as a political scientist, the consolidation of power that Mohammed bin Salman has been able to carry out means he's probably not going to get a lot of local resistance or I think public debate about this in terms of him censoring a lot of these kinds of public criticism. And so chances are, I think this is an opportune time to get the kinds of reforms that they've been wanting to do. But again, there's a lot of these sectors that Saudi Arabia is moving into that I think are going to be really difficult because the long-term scarring, in my humble opinion, is there. And I don't think we're going to get the recovery that they want to really bring those back into normalcy. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions.
Well, thank you very much. I think now it's time for us to have a little conversation between us before we get to the questions and answer questions from the audience. And I was interested in what Dr. Findakly said about the need to diversify the Saudi economy. Vision 2030 attempts to do that, but so is every other plan. This Vision 2030 is effectively the 10th Saudi 5-year plan. It is a little different in some ways in that it was written by outside consultants as opposed to the government itself or international organizations, but it does call for many of the same things. It specifically wants to do some diversification into mining, tourism, entertainment, as Dr. Momani said, retail, and then interestingly, build their own defense industry. I was wondering if Dr. Findakly thought that any of those things had a realistic chance of helping to diversify the economy away from oil?
The answer is in principle, yes, they do. They do create new economic activities, but I'm not sure that they create jobs. I stated in my remarks that one of the biggest concerns I had was that the Vision 2030 did not address the fundamental issues in the structural issues in the Saudi economy. So let me just give you one example. An average Saudi worker, an average worker in Saudi Arabia costs about $45,000 to hire. That's on average across all skill levels from low to high. The productivity of the average worker in Saudi Arabia, the output of the average worker in Saudi Arabia is $42,000. So it's a net a loss of about 9%, 8 to 9% for every worker you're hiring. And that goes across both Saudis and non-Saudis. It is, as Dr. Momani mentioned, productivity of the non-Saudi workers is slightly lower, about 15% lower than the expat worker. The average for OECD economies is that an average worker must generate roughly 2.5 times its cost. So Saudi Arabia faces a very major fundamental issue in the restructuring of its economy without addressing this fundamental issue. So yes, mining, entertainment, even though it may not work today, but it will work in the long term. All of those new activities, including military industries, are pretty useful and important issues. So how do you address the issue of raising productivity? The economists have done an awful lot of work in this area, and there are some things to discuss that's well beyond what I have in time in responding to this issue. So my approach would be to basically focus on what is possible. And what is possible is that there is a lot of capital that's available in Saudi Arabia today, both in the private hands and in the public hands. But there is very little risk capital that is available. And my thought is that instead of focusing on these, what I call white elephant projects, NEOM project is a classic example of that, $450 billion investment that will absorb every dollar of foreign exchange reserves that the country has for this one project. That is basically designed to have an automated city of robots at a time when unemployment rate is 12%, arguably higher, and it's close to 40% among youth. It's about 30% among 20 to 25-year age in Saudi Arabia. It's a totally non-feasible project. So focusing on small business formation that raises the productivity of the labor force, and at the same time employs and absorbs quite a bit of the unemployed youth, would probably be a more feasible and more reasonable policy than having these large unproductive projects that do not create jobs.
So I think that was a great explanation. You helped us understand, really, I think, that the Saudis have real limits to what they can do with their monetary policy in your first talk, and that the fact that their interest rates are effectively controlled by the Federal Reserve because of the dollar peg. So they're limited in monetary policy. They're limited in their fiscal policy, at least up until fairly recently, because it's hard to have a fiscal policy in a country that doesn't have any taxes. So they have not had much of the way of taxes until very recently. And then you just hit the nail on the head, really, when you pointed out that there is most countries in the world, the living standard of the people is very closely tied to their productivity, and that in Saudi Arabia, the two are divorced. And that leaves them with a major structural problem, which we hope that their Vision 2030 can address, but it's still, as you say, we have to wait and see. And that, I think if I heard you correctly, that the way to do it is not to focus on mega projects, but to find smaller and more doable, discrete items to do. My next question, I think, would be for Dr. Nakshbendi. You talked about the oil as being the key driver, really, to what happens in Saudi Arabia. I don't think anyone would argue with you about that. I wondered if you had any thoughts about Saudi oil policy going forward and whether or not you think they will, number one, focus on market share, or whether they will focus on oil prices. That would be the first part of my question. And then secondly, in terms of their strategy for cooperation with Russia, how do you see that going forward?
Well, actually, before I answer that, I just want to add one element concerning the comment that was made by my colleague, Dr. Findakly. I would like to emphasize the need for technology transfer. Technology transfer, to me, is a key point for Saudi in order to energize its own economy and diversification and what have you. And that could be done very easily by implementing the offset programs, which have been used in Kuwait and UAE and other countries in the Gulf. Going back, I am not an oil expert, but my interpretation of what's going on recently is that aside from the question of market share, I think there is a need to strengthen the position of OPEC now, because we have OPEC Plus, which include Russia, and finally, I think the risk that Saudi took when they started their engagement with Russia about reducing the output and what have you. Finally, I think they have a new agreement now, which I think lasts until the end of June, by reducing the daily output by 1.2 million barrel. And I hope it will work. But in the meantime, let's face it, I mean, Saudi is the leader in the OPEC, and consequently, what they have to do is how to encourage other OPEC members to follow suit. We know that Iran is not following the quota restrictions, and that's my understanding that other countries as well, they are not following simply because of their need for revenue and plus the decline in oil prices. So going forward, definitely Saudi has to reclaim their leadership in terms of OPEC, and in the meantime, they have to find a better way to deal with Russia in terms of sort of coordinating their plans, OPEC plans, with a very important competitor, which is Russia. But definitely, the demand for oil, as we know, went down. Again, going back to the question of COVID-19, but all indications as of yesterday that things are getting more positive, and consequently oil is going to catch up, including the demand by, as you know, by China and India, which are major players in terms of creating demand for oil in the world. Plus, hopefully that they have to find out more ways and means by which they can, as I said, coordinate their activities by using a more diplomatic ways in order to deal with the competitors as well.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, Dr. Momani talked a little bit about the labor market. I think we all know that the Saudi labor market is rather broken compared to most countries. In most countries, the work in the private sector is done by local people In Saudi Arabia, they rely on foreigners. In most countries, most of the native people work in the private sector. In Saudi Arabia, they mostly work for the government. And in most economies, women play an important role in the labor force. Again, in Saudi Arabia, at least until very recently, that's not the case. So I wondered if Dr. Momani had seen any changes since the beginning of Vision 2030 in how the Saudi labor force has begun to correct some of these inefficiencies in terms of dependence on government jobs, foreign labor, and the exclusion of women from the labor force.
Thanks, David. So yes, there's been a lot of movement in this space, and we've seen almost from a participation rate of 0 to 30%, if not higher now. I can't say I've been following what's the latest participation rate of Saudi women in the economy, or in the labor force. But yes, it's certainly in increase. And of course, you have to get rid of everything from them not being able to drive, which they've done, because how else are you going to get to work, to opening sectors, because some of the gender segregation that exists in the labor force are legal segregations. It's not just customs and social values, which of course is a whole other host of challenges that's still before many women in Saudi Arabia to actually get that kind of full participation. But just the legal parameters are certainly still there. And so they're chipping away at it. And so there's everything, lots of creative things that Saudi companies are doing to get more women involved in the public sector as well. And certainly the government has been trying to chip away at some of these regulations. As I always say, I think in this particular area, we probably see more receptivity amongst the young. There's still a very traditional, conservative, older generation that are not accustomed to these changes, and you just have to follow social media angst to see how many Saudis are still very much not accustomed to seeing women in different roles. But that's changing, and actually I think that's really a smart move just on the economic front. Take aside the normative aspect of it, because I think as a person of great defender of human rights, I think women should have a right to participate in the economy as part of their own individual and intellectual fulfillment. But just thinking about the lack of having the full participation of your intellectual talent in your economy is just devastating to any economy. And so if you're going to really get to the kinds of productivity numbers that one wants, to the kind of growth number that one wants, you have to have at minimum at least half of your society have the opportunity to participate. So I can't speak enough about that. That said, I think one thing that is we've seen also is a lot of investment in the SME sector, a lot of money put into entrepreneurship. This has become the flavor of the month for every, not just Gulf economy, but Middle East economy. And I'm a huge proponent of it because it's important to allow, both particularly young people, but a lot of women as well, their creativity in creating their own businesses. But this is one thing about the pandemic that really, I think, saddens me, because it's a global problem, and I see it certainly in Canada, and we're going to see it, I think, throughout much of the West as well, which is, the SME sector is going to really suffer. This has really hit small businesses hard. As we all know, cash flow of most small businesses is usually 2 to 3 months forward, and this is a pandemic that has hit that sector very doubly hard, because they tend to be in the service sector, they tend to be focused on retail, and that's where there's been a complete lockdown. So it's really challenging. It's a difficult time to find recovery. I think, in fact, maybe some smart investment here in the government is to help more of these SMEs. And again, there has been business support measures out there. It's not to say that they haven't done that, but the SMEs tend to always be left last, often because there's this feeling that one needs to help the big flagship companies that employ in the thousands. SMEs tend to sometimes employ less than 50 people on average. So it's really hard to see the value in that. But if you want to have the kind of competitiveness in your economy, certainly a lot of women have gone into entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia. If you want to ensure women's productivity, you need to help that sector. And so there's going to be a need for creative policies at the government level to try and really ensure that this sector doesn't completely decimate as a result of this pandemic as well.
All right. Well, I think we can now turn to some of the questions that people have sent in. We have quite a few of them here, and I will try and see if I can find some that you could answer relatively quickly. Some of them I think would require a thesis to answer. But one in particular is what has the Saudi government done or could it do to increase the attractiveness of Saudi Arabia to foreign investment? Donnie, what would you suggest that they do to increase the attractiveness for FDI in Saudi Arabia?
Well, they've done already quite a bit in doing that by facilitating the entry of foreign investments into the country, by streamlining and creating a one-stop shopping for foreign investors through some enactment of some rules that allow foreign investors to repatriate, to bring in and to repatriate their profits and their capital investments. The biggest impediment, I think, for the Saudi foreign direct investment, which is pretty low, by the way, the total Saudi foreign investment, given its massive role in the energy sector and the economy, outside of the energy sector, there's probably less than $1 billion a year of foreign direct investment outside of the oil and petrochemical sector. That is about a quarter of what Kazakhstan gets in foreign direct investment. So it tells you that the biggest impediment to foreign direct investment in Saudi Arabia is really access to skills and a legal system that is completely opaque and very inefficient. The Emiratis and the UAE next door dealt with that by creating special investment zone and allowed an international arbitration rules under UK law to adjudicate any kind of issues related to conflicts or problems. Saudi Arabia doesn't have that. I sit on the board of several Saudi companies, have done that for the last 25, 30 years. And as chairman of an audit committee of 2 or 3 of the largest family-owned companies, I've spent quite a bit of my time dealing with court issues related to property rights, centralized registry system for real estate, and variety of other issues in which the courts deal with it in an extremely inefficient way, and a legal system that is totally opaque and very difficult to deal with. And I think that's the biggest impediment to foreign direct investment in Saudi Arabia, and for private investment by the Saudi investors themselves.
Thank you. We have another question which comes from Charles Kestenbaum, and he asks essentially whether you can open the economy while, if you will, clamping down on political freedoms. That there seems to be a dramatic opening of social change in Saudi Arabia, from entertainment to women's rights. There is at least a plan for changing the economy, but at the same time, there seems to be a clamping down on what were already rather limited political freedoms. So I wondered if any of you, and I won't, whichever one of you would like to answer that question, I'd be happy to let you speak.
I'd love to take that one, David, because it really reminds me of something that was just noted. You know, I think you can put all the legal reforms in place, all of the sort of investors protection laws in place. But the reality is you need to have people be confident and wanting to invest in Saudi Arabia. And look, the reality is the headlines speak for themselves, right? I mean, people do not look at Saudi Arabia as this place for open competition. It is very much clouded by the reality that Mohammed bin Salman has taken up a lot of oxygen in Western media. And, you know, frankly, he's seen as one that consolidates power and is willing to lock businesses up to do a shakedown and take some of their money. You know, we can quibble about the details, but that's the impression. And frankly, it's going to be really hard for a company to feel 100% confident that it goes into a Saudi market and plunks down a lot of money and it won't be subject to this kind of shakedown. So that is a challenge, and I don't think you can ignore that reality. And this is part of the need to sort of instill confidence in the business sector. And look, there's going to be lots of PR exercises. We saw lots of that with, Mohammed bin Salman, touring the world in recent years. And certainly them being the president of the G20 this year is an attempt to kind of bring positive PR. But, frankly, for the amount of, damage it's done to its PR to hold very, I think, I want to say what the word is, but, individuals like Lujan Halfoun, who's a friend of mine, is unnecessary. It really just doesn't bring any value to the regime, but it just kind of puts them in negative light constantly. And it was like the driving ban, we saw once it was removed, it was really, I think, successfully rolled out. And we saw a lot of positive change come from it. And it was just not worth it in terms of the negative PR that the country had. And so there's a whole host of people in Saudi prisons that, just need to be released. And I think you're going to get a lot of positive result from that if the government puts that kind of, real holistic view of the world. The China model that, that we know that this government has espoused is frankly not going to apply to Saudi Arabia. Call it what it is. It's been fetishized by the Western media. It is what it is. And I think the Western businesses, which is at the end of the day where you're going to get that foreign direct investment, are going to always be wary about investing in Saudi Arabia as long as you have this continued, coverage of the very true repression of freedom of thought.
Thank you. We have a question on the fiscal policy, and I think we have the expert on fiscal policy, Dr. Nakshbendi. Olivia Golden from Britain actually asks, what areas do you think the government should cut spending in, or will it cut spending in as a result of the COVID epidemic? And how will this affect Vision 2030 going forward?
Well, again, I will venture to say that one of the areas, obviously, aside from these extraordinary mega projects, I will suggest that, again, we have to take it with some kind of modification, that the percentage of GDP which is spent on armament, it is one of the highest in the GCC countries, actually. So this is an area which I think it needs some kind of assessment, whether they need all this armament that they are buying from Western nations. But in addition to that, I think what is important here is to lessen, and they are doing that, lessen all the subsidies and what have you that's given to people, their citizens. And I think that requires some kind of bold initiative to make citizens aware of the value of working harder, and in order to limit or to live in accordance with their income as well. And so these are two areas that I think should be considered. In the meantime, I am not so optimistic about this, the income tax, but to increase or the value added tax, which I think it will have, to me, it may have a positive impact in the short run, but in the long run, I think it will suppress the expenditures by the population who live in Saudi Arabia. So that's how I see it. In the meantime, I think there are lots of expenses that are being spent on the public that could be reduced. For example, one of the things which really I feel so bad about it, that they have been reducing the amount of money that is devoted to provide scholarships for Saudi students going abroad, which I think it is it is counterproductive because they need to send more and more of their young students to Western countries in order to get the know-how.
Okay.
Can I
Thank you.
make a comment, Mr.
Sure.
Moderator, on the fiscal policy issue and the tax issue? U.S. taxes, federal taxes as a percent of GDP is about 18%. And if you define taxes as the government revenue as a percentage of the economy, Saudi Arabia has, and the GCC countries in general, have on average received, because they control the entire resources that the country has, which is oil and related mineral resources. Their take out of the economy, out of GDP, is about 23%. By adding a 5% value-added taxes on consumption, it raises their take from the economy from 23% to about 25 to 26%. Raising it to 15% increases the share of government revenue from as a percent of GDP to about 29 to 30%. And that makes Saudi Arabia, and it makes the GCC countries, if they follow that 15% model, to be the highest tax countries on earth.
Okay. I have an interesting question here. I'll leave it for whoever wants to answer it. And that is, there seems to be a warming between Saudi Arabia, of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. We have seen Israeli rabbis visit the king. We are seeing flights, overflights from other countries that flying over Saudi Arabia to Tel Aviv. We've even seen the Saudi football team pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Do you believe that there could be any economic benefits from a warming of relationships between Saudi Arabia and Israel?
I'll take that. The beauty of, anyways. No, I mean, reality is, look, it's a PR exercise, and I think much of the Saudi elite have assumed that by having friendly ties with Israel, they're going to be somehow, escape the wrath of Donald Trump and others in the White House. And maybe there's truth to that. I don't know. I don't think it's really beneficial for the economy. I mean, they have been dealing business with each other for some time now, mostly in the surveillance space. Israel is a huge exporter of surveillance technology, and the Gulf has been buying that technology for some time now. So there's been some strong economic ties already there, but much of it in the background. But look, they're not natural trading partners in any way. There's no, I think, real investment that's going to come from either side. It's going to always be a cold peace. It's never going to be anything warm and fuzzy. I mean, I just don't see any benefit to it on the economic side. Certainly on the geopolitical, you can say that, this is a meeting of the minds, particularly when it comes to sort of Iran. And certainly it allies, an alliance sort of in the White House makes it really, I think, very comfortable for the Saudi government to have close ties with the Israelis. But there's no economic benefit to that. If I could just quickly add too, as we're all talking about where is the Saudi government going to find, some of that fiscal space, look, defense funding is still huge. And there's been discussion in the Vision 2030 about domesticating some of that in terms of producing it inside Saudi Arabia, which, I find sounds good, but in reality, it's not really, I think, going to materialize very much. And I think there is some potential here. We're seeing, hopefully, the war in Yemen wind down, but also the reality that I think the Saudi government bought a lot of arms from the Americans to please Trump. I mean, let's not forget the very clear picture opportunity when Mohammed bin Salman was in the White House to meet with Trump, and Trump was very happy to talk about how much weapons that the Saudis bought. And I think that indeed that the Saudis probably overbought what they, they don't need all of what they got, but some of it they just wanted to please Trump. And November is not too far away. If there is a change in government, that might actually, motivate, and I hope it does, because Saudi Arabia has been wasting a lot of money on its defense spending at the expense of I think, other spending, that might actually be, you know, a good move to indeed think about how to really diminish that fiscal outlay, which is huge, and again, in the unproductive sector.
Before I ask one last question, does anybody else want to comment on that? Potential development. Oh, okay. The very last question really we have time for today basically says that we heard on the one hand a strongly argued case that the Saudi welfare state is over and we don't really know what's coming next. And on the other hand, we heard some rather less gloomy predictions that perhaps the system can be reformed. Would anybody like to chime in? I think we all know who said what in terms of which was more gloomy and which was perhaps more optimistic. Does anybody have a comment as to where they think that really will go? Is the Saudi welfare, let me just phrase it differently. Is the Saudi welfare state over, or can it be reformed?
I think it is not over, and I think there will be reform. And as I mentioned earlier, that we have to appreciate the fact that we are entering an era that is very special, and we never encountered that in the past. And consequently, like any other entity, like any other government, they have to live within the revenue and the expenses and the expenditures. They have to live within their means, and consequently, I am expecting lots of changes that will take place in order to change the attitude of people in terms of relying on government and starting to live on their own, and find ways and means by which they can rely less on government subsidies. So I'm optimistic.
Could I chime in on this subject?
Surely.
The Saudi welfare state has been over for the last 5 years, and it is over right now. All subsidies of basic goods and services have been reduced or eliminated, and they will never come back. There's no room for them to come back. The fact that the 3 million out of the 14 million labor force in Saudi Arabia are Saudis, 2.5 million of them work for the government, cannot anymore be sustained, and therefore it will be reduced. So the government as an employer of last resort role is over. Where the next phase of change is going to take place is still uncertain, and what capital and resources will be allocated to create the new economic model is still in question. I have proposed some ideas or advanced some ideas along these lines. One of the biggest sources of capital that's totally untapped in Saudi Arabia and in most of the Muslim world is what is in English called Islamic trusts, what's in Arabic called awqaf. Waqf is a concept of a trust that the British and the Crusaders got from the Arab world, the Islamic world, when they invaded in the 13th century. And they brought back to Britain, that became the basis of the trust law in the UK that American trust law is based upon. There is, in my estimate, about $1.5 trillion of trust assets that exist across the Middle East. About half of it, $700 to $800 billion of that, resides in Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries. That is an enormous amount of capital that could be a source of funding for entrepreneurship, for re-energizing the economy in ways that the meager government income of no more than 70 million to $80 billion of US dollars from the sale of oil that the government can muster these days, that can be deployed and utilized, again, that is subject to a major reform and changes in the legal system that allows it to happen.
So can I hear that again? How much money did you say that Saudi Waqf or Al-Qaf have?
Well, my estimate worldwide from Morocco to Hong Kong to Singapore to China is about $1.5 trillion in total. My other estimate is about 700 billion of that resides within the GCC Middle East region, and Saudi Arabia probably has about a third, about a third to a half of that. So we're talking about 300 to 500 billion US dollars that is frozen assets in effect, and that people obviously don't care about risk. And that is, in my view, is a major source of risk capital that could energize the economies of the region that no other source of money could replace it or could compete with it.
That's very interesting. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time and not to the end of our questions, I'm afraid, but to the end of our time. And I want to thank all three of the speakers. Each of them contributed not only on the area that they were to talk about, but on a wide range of questions. And we really appreciate the fact that they took the time to join us today and to share with us some of their knowledge and expertise. And I think Ambassador Theros would like to make the closing comment. So I'll turn it over to him. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will make a comment. For some reason, my video has gone dead, but it's been great. I've been looking at the chat. A good turnout to watch this, and most of our visitors were extremely impressed with the skill, knowledge, broadband of our panelists, and we look forward to see you at our next event very shortly. Thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon, good evening, and stay very safe, please.
Thank you all. Be safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.